The sun glared down on Dust Well like it held a grudge, bleaching the crooked clapboards of every weather-bitten saloon and shuttered store. A low wind kicked grit along the main street, hissing around booth heels and wagon wheels. By the time Evie Carter reined her mule into the crowd near the sheriff's office, her throat was dry and her hands were raw from the reins. She dismounted in silence, slipping through the townsfolk who parted only to gawk. Not at her. At the spectacle unfolding in front of the livery barn. A makeshift auction platform stood crooked over the cracked earth. Sheriff Dugan leaned against a broken hitch post, pretending not to care. Clinton Graves, with silver spurs and a voice like gravel soaked in whiskey, stood center stage, one boot on a crate and a deed rolled tight in his fist. "This here's the last of the Carter land," he sneered, waving the paper like a flag of conquest. "Unworked. Undeserved. And finally mine." Evie's jaw clenched as the townspeople clapped half-heartedly. Her father had once tilled those fields with calloused hands and faith stitched into every furrow. Now he lay feverish in a rented bed while Graves claimed what illness and drought hadn't yet taken. "Wait." Her voice cracked across the square. Heads turned. She stepped forward, boots trailing dust, eyes burning. Graves smiled slowly, like a coyote catching scent of blood. "Well now, the little weed speaks." Evie's voice was steady this time. "You can't just take our land. My father, he just needs time." He descended from the platform with the lazy grace of a predator. "Time don't plow fields, girl. And debts don't pay themselves." She reached into her coat and pulled free a yellowed letter. He wrote to Judge Hillman. "The courts." "Courts don't matter out here," Graves cut in, tone low but sharp. "Out here, grit and horses rule. And you got neither." Someone snorted in the crowd. Someone else muttered, "She can't even ride." The stallion screamed from behind the livery barn, high and violent like a lightning bolt torn loose. Graves tilted his head toward the sound, a smirk curling across his face. "Tell you what. I got a challenge for you, Miss Carter." He sauntered past her, and the crowd followed. Curiosity makes sheep of most men. They rounded the barn to see it, a beast of coal and muscle, flanks heaving, hooves scoring furrows into the dry ground. Its mane whipped like black fire, and its eyes glinted with something far too human. Fury, maybe. Pride. Madness. The stable hands kept back, ropes slack and terror obvious. "That," Graves said, "is Omen." Broke 5 men's ribs. Trampled a vaquero clean through. Paid top dollar for him, thinking he'd run my cattle operation. Instead, he just runs hell. The stallion turned his head, nostrils flaring as he locked eyes with Evie. She didn't blink. "If you can train him," Graves went on, "I'll sign your daddy's ranch back over, every acre. If you can't—" He let the silence linger like smoke. "You leave Dust Well and never speak the Carter name again." Laughter rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. Evie stared at the horse. Omen's chest rose and fell like he'd swallowed a storm. His coat was laced with old scars, and his ears twitched in restless defiance. "I'll need a saddle," she said. "No saddle," Graves grinned. "Just time. 30 days. You ride him across the square by month's end, or he buries you in it." Someone gasped. A woman tugged her son behind her apron. Evie's hands trembled as she stepped closer to the fence, close enough to smell the sweat and dust rising off the animal. "I'll do it," she said, her voice low. "Then let the games begin," Graves drawled. That night, she slept in a lean-to beside the corral, wrapped in her mother's old shawl. The ground was hard, and the wind smelled like gunpowder. Omen paced the fence all night, eyes glowing dim in the moonlight. In the darkness, Evie whispered promises to herself she didn't entirely believe. She told herself it wasn't about pride, that it was about land and legacy, and the father who had raised her when no one else stayed. But in the marrow of her bones, she knew it was also something more raw, a fury she'd never named, a refusal to be laughed off, stepped over, forgotten. Her first attempt came with the pink edge of dawn. She stepped into the pen slow, her hands open, boots dragging shallow furrows behind her. Omen snorted, his flanks quivering. She barely reached his shoulder before he reared back and struck. The kick missed by inches and sent her rolling into the dirt. She coughed, spat blood, and stood again. By noon she'd been knocked down 4 more times. Her lip was split. Her wrist ached. Her braid hung loose and dusty, streaked with sweat. Graves watched from the edge of the barn, a cigar smoldering between 2 fingers. "Should have stayed home and baked biscuits," he called. She ignored him. She watched the horse. She listened. On the 3rd day, thunder rolled in from the south. The storm broke over Dustwell with a fury that sent shutters slamming and animals crying out. Evie stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, holding a rope in both hands while Omen circled her like a spirit unbound. Lightning flashed. For a moment, she saw herself in the stallion's eye, not as she was, but as she wanted to be. Unafraid. Unbroken. Worthy. He didn't charge. He didn't flee. He simply stood still. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat under the lean-to, fireless, hugging her knees against the cold. Her hands were blistered. Her body bruised. But in her chest, where doubt usually gnawed, there was a spark. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But she knew she would meet it, standing. The morning after the storm, the air hung heavy and wet, and the world smelled of scorched earth and bent grass. Evie stood at the edge of the corral, arms crossed over bruised ribs, eyes locked on Omen. The stallion pawed at the mud, nostrils flaring, coat streaked with rain and dust. He was no calmer than the day before, but he wasn't charging anymore. That, she told herself, was something. She reached out with a halter in hand, voice low and steady. "We don't have to fight today. Just breathe." He didn't come. But he didn't bolt either. He watched her the way a hawk might watch a mouse that wasn't running. By midday, her legs were trembling from standing still too long, but she didn't retreat. It was the first rule she had started to understand. Not dominance, not control, but presence. Omen wasn't waiting for force. He was waiting to be seen. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a shadow fell across her left shoulder. She turned sharply, half expecting Graves or one of his cowhands. Instead, she saw a tall figure, quiet as smoke, watching the horse from under the hood of a worn buffalo-hide cloak. His face bore the wind like it was an old friend, creases carved deep into sun-darkened skin, a scar split down the edge of his cheekbone like a forgotten river. He said nothing. His eyes, the color of dying coals, flicked to her, then back to the horse. He took a slow step forward, then knelt near the fence, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. From beneath his cloak, he produced a bundle wrapped in hide, herbs, feathers, a bone-carved token strung on sinew. He placed it gently on the post and stood. "Who are you?" she asked, voice hoarse from the dry wind. Still, he said nothing. Just nodded once, then turned and walked back the way he came, disappearing between 2 cottonwoods before she could say another word. The token remained, swaying slightly in the breeze. Omen turned his head toward it, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The stallion's body seemed to relax by degrees, his muscles no longer tight with expectation. Evie didn't know who the man was, but she tied the token to the fence post, letting it hang there like a silent pact. That night, she found her water barrels filled and her saddle stitched where it had torn. Someone had worked by moonlight while she slept. On the 5th morning, she entered the pen again, moving slower than before, softer. Omen tossed his head but did not retreat. When she offered a handful of oats, he sniffed and stepped forward, 2 paces, no more, but enough to make her heart stutter in her chest. The silent stranger appeared again that afternoon, sitting at a distance, sharpening a knife on a flat stone. This time, Evie approached him cautiously, her fingers brushing the edge of her worn skirt. "You helped me," she said. "Why?" He glanced at her, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was low, like gravel under water. "Horse sees your shadow before your hand." She frowned. "What does that mean?" He tapped his chest. "What's inside, he knows. He fights ghosts, not ropes." "Is that what I am to him? A ghost?" The man shrugged, then stood and walked past her toward the corral. He didn't enter, just stood at the edge, watching Omen, who whinnied once and stomped the ground. The man lifted his hand, palm open, and waited. Omen stilled. Evie stared. "You know horses. I know fear." He turned his gaze to her. "And I know what they do with it." She didn't ask his name. It felt too fragile, too human. But the next day he returned again. And the next. They didn't talk much. Sometimes he showed her how to stand, where to place her feet, how to breathe in rhythm with the horse's nostrils. Sometimes he left herbs to mix in water, or applied a salve to her bruises without asking. His presence was steady, unspoken. She learned that Omen responded to breath, not touch. That pressure behind the ears mattered more than the tightest reins. That trust wasn't seized, it was earned, slow as rivers carving canyons. Graves noticed. He started watching closer, lingering on the edge of the pen with his arms folded, a fresh cigar clenched between yellowed teeth. One afternoon, he approached as Evie leaned against the gate, sweat rolling down her neck, dust streaking her arms. "Heard you got help now," he said, voice casual but sharp around the edges. "Some Injun ghost drifting in like smoke." She said nothing. Graves smiled, though it didn't touch his eyes. "Be careful who you trust out here. Some men'll help you just to watch you fall harder." That night, her tack was slashed. The grain had been fouled with kerosene. She found a dead crow nailed to the side of the corral. She buried it with shaking hands, rage and fear twisted together in her chest like barbed wire. When the stranger arrived, he said nothing at first. Just looked at the broken saddle, the ruined feed. Then he handed her a length of sinew and a new saddle stitcher, his hands calloused and quiet. She didn't cry until he left. Then she did, silently, shoulders shaking as she worked under starlight to mend what had been torn. Not just the saddle. Her belief in something good. In being seen. By the 12th day, Omen allowed her to brush his flanks. By the 15th, she led him to water, the rope loose in her hands. When the stranger saw them walking together, he gave the smallest nod, barely a gesture at all. That night, she brought out 2 tin cups and a kettle. They sat by the fire, her shawl over both their shoulders, steam curling into the night. She looked at him, eyes rimmed red but bright. "My name's Evie," she said. He looked toward the flames, then back at her. "Kale." It was the only word they shared for the rest of the evening. But it was enough. On the 17th day, Omen let her rest her forehead against his. It was only for a moment, but her heart felt like it might crack open from the quiet power of it. Kale stood nearby, watching with arms crossed, the carved talisman now hanging from the stallion's neck like a seal of fragile trust. Evie exhaled, steady and sure, as she whispered, "You're not a demon. You're just waiting for someone not to give up." The horse didn't answer. He didn't have to. And somewhere beyond the trees, Graves was watching, his patience thinning like the last thread on a noose. The morning of the final day came with a red sun rising over Dustwell, casting long, blood-colored shadows across the hard-packed earth. The town was restless, pulled from their routines by something more primal than gossip. Men left tools half-buried in the fields. Women paused with wash still dripping from their lines. Even the preacher stood in the street, Bible forgotten in one hand, waiting. Evie stood behind the livery barn, saddle in hand, fingers trembling. Her shirt clung to her back, soaked not from heat, but from the weight of expectation. 30 days ago, she'd been little more than a poor farmer's daughter, laughed at and pitied. Now, eyes followed her wherever she walked, not with scorn, but with a cautious kind of hope, like folks weren't quite ready to believe in her but feared they might have to. Kale stood beside her, silent as ever. He handed her a small bundle of dried sage and watched as she tucked it into her saddlebag. His eyes, steady and unreadable, lingered on her face longer than usual. "You don't ride today," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She looked up sharply. "What?" "You fly," he said. Then turned and walked away without waiting for her answer. She didn't call after him. His words lodged in her chest like a stone. Inside the corral, Omen waited, still and statuesque, his obsidian coat gleaming in the early light. He pawed once at the ground as she approached, not with rage, but with recognition. Evie pressed her forehead to his, inhaling deeply, grounding herself. "This isn't about the ranch anymore," she whispered. "It's about who I become when I don't quit." No one spoke as she led Omen through the main street. They just moved aside, making way. Sheriff Dugan nodded once. The blacksmith gave a low whistle. Somewhere, a baby cried, then fell silent. Graves stood in the center of the square, hands behind his back, teeth bared in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He looked immaculate, cruel in his pressed jacket and polished boots. The deed lay on a wooden crate beside him, weighed down with a rock and arrogance. "Well," he drawled, "either this is gonna be a hell of a show, or the shortest funeral Dustwell's seen." Evie didn't respond. She mounted Omen without hesitation. No stirrups. No bit. Just rope and trust. Her hands were steady. Her knees gripped tight. Her heart, though pounding, did not falter. Graves stepped aside with exaggerated flair. "Let's see your miracle, girl." She gave no command. She didn't shout or dig her heels. She just leaned forward, whispered something into Omen's ear no one else could hear. The stallion surged forward. Gasps rose from the crowd. People backed away as Omen galloped through the town square, hooves thundering like drums of war. Evie held no reins, just her breath and balance. The horse didn't buck, didn't rear. He ran, unshackled and glorious, as if the town itself had called for proof that something wild could be tamed by kindness. At the far end of the square, she wheeled him in a perfect arc and brought him back to Graves, slowing just inches from the man's boots. Silence held Dustwell like a closed fist. Then a cheer rose, one, then another, then the whole town breaking into wild applause, boots stomping and voices raised in disbelief and celebration. For the first time, they weren't watching a Carter girl try and fail. They were watching a woman ride the wind. Graves' jaw clenched. He picked up the deed, eyes narrow, and held it out. "You win," he said. "As agreed." Evie took it without a word. But as she turned to go, he spoke again, louder this time, bitter. "Don't think this means anything. You got lucky with one beast. But life out here breaks better people than you." She stopped, looked back, and for once, her voice didn't shake. "Then let it try." That night, as the townsfolk returned to their homes and the sun sank behind the hills, Evie stood at the edge of her reclaimed land. The house still sagged with rot. The fences were brittle. Nothing had grown in the fields for months. But it was hers. She dismounted and walked Omen to the old well. Cale was there already, sitting cross-legged, sipping from a tin cup. "You came back," she said. "Didn't leave," he answered simply. She sat beside him, arms resting on her knees, the silence between them easy now. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted after a while. "Some days I woke up already sure I'd fail." Cale nodded once. "That's what makes it worth doing." She looked at him, this stranger who had become her compass. "Will you stay?" He didn't answer right away. Just reached into his cloak and pulled out the bone talisman. "I've got places to walk," he said. "But I'll pass through again. When the wind circles back." Evie smiled, small but real. "Then I'll leave the gate open." Cale rose, his figure dark against the fading sky. Omen lifted his head as he passed and gave a low snort, almost like goodbye. And as Cale disappeared into the dusk, Evie stood alone beneath the stars, no longer a poor farmer's daughter, not just a survivor. She was something else now. Not because she had won, but because she had refused to vanish. And in Dustwell, where memory was often short and stories twisted like the wind, folks would remember that ride. The day the wild stallion bowed to the girl no one believed in. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you've had to tame in your life, and what you learned from it. And if you believe that grit, heart, and second chances still matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll be here with more stories from the frontier, where legends aren't born. They're earned. A week passed, and the dust of celebration settled into routine. The townsfolk stopped gawking. The whispers dulled to nods. The girl who'd tamed the Baron's beast was no longer a spectacle. She was a fixture. Yet for Evie, the quiet that followed victory felt more dangerous than the challenge itself. There was no one watching now. No deadline to meet. Just the land, her land, and everything broken still waiting to be mended. The barn sagged worse than she'd remembered. The water pump sputtered like it might give up entirely. She spent her days mending fence lines, coaxing seeds into soil that hadn't seen honest rain in months, and waking up in the night with a nagging fear that it had all been a dream. Omen stayed near, grazing in the dry field, watching her with those deep, ancient eyes. There were no more outbursts, no more storms in his muscles. But she could feel it, the wild still lived in him. It always would. That was the quiet pact between them. He'd given her a piece of himself, not all. That was enough. Cale hadn't returned. Every dusk, she glanced toward the hill where he first appeared, a cup of coffee warming her palms, pretending she wasn't hoping. But the wind brought no sign. Just silence, and the whistle of mourning doves. She didn't blame him. She'd never asked for forever. Men like him were made to roam. Still, the absence sat heavy in her chest, like the last words of a song that refused to end. It was on a morning stained with ash-gray clouds that the first signs of trouble came. She found hoof prints near the back fence. Too many to be stray cattle. Too shallow for stampede. No branding irons had marked them, and they led in a lazy arc toward the creek, then vanished. By midday, her neighbor Thomas limped down the path, hat clutched in one hand, worry carved into every wrinkle. His livestock were gone. All 10 head. Pens broken. No sound, no blood. Just absence. They didn't run, he said, voice low. They were taken. Evie nodded slowly. Graves. Thomas hesitated. Could be. But I think it's worse than that. I think he brought someone new into the game. That evening, she saddled Omen. She rode low through the brush, eyes scanning for movement, rifle slung across her back. The world felt tighter somehow, like the air had thickened. Just beyond the ridge, she found the tracks again. Hooves. Boots. But not many. 3 riders, maybe 4. And fire pits, used recently. She turned back, heart thudding. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. 2 nights later, they struck. The smoke woke her first. Then came the sounds, hooves, laughter, splintering wood. She burst from the shack, rifle raised, just in time to see the barn lit up in flames. 3 riders wheeled their horses in a taunting circle. One, masked and broad-shouldered, raised a torch and hurled it toward the water trough. Another laughed as Omen reared, fighting against the fence line. Evie didn't hesitate. She fired once, the sound cracking through the dark. The rider with the torch tumbled from his horse with a scream. The others scattered, hooves pounding into the distance. She dropped the rifle and ran to the corral, bare hands working to free Omen. His eyes rolled, nostrils flared with panic, but he didn't kick. She yanked open the gate just as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. Together, they stood against the red glow, both of them heaving, sweat and smoke mingling in the night air. When dawn came, the fire was out, but the damage was clear. Half the fencing was gone. Her barn lay in ruin. A dead man bled into the dust 30 yards from her porch. Sheriff Dugan rode in later, jaw tight, eyes scanning the wreckage. "He's one of Graves' men," he muttered. "But I don't think this was just about land." Evie looked at him, face smeared with ash. "It never was. You're alone out here, Carter. No shame in asking for help." She shook her head. "I've asked enough. Now I act." She buried the dead man herself, patched the fencing as best she could, moved what feed remained into the shack to keep it dry. But something had shifted. There would be more. The fire wasn't the end, it was the start of a war she hadn't declared. That night, she didn't sleep. And in the early hours before sunrise, when even the stars had retreated, Cale returned. She heard the hoofbeats first, soft, like memory. Then saw his shadow through the smoke-hung dawn. "You came back," she said, stepping out with arms crossed. Cale looked at the ashes, then at her, his expression unreadable. "They'll come again. I know." He walked to Omen, ran a hand down the stallion's neck. Then he turned back to her. "You've changed." Evie nodded. "Because I had to." Cale reached into his coat, drew out a leather-wrapped pouch, and handed it to her. Inside were sharpened blades, a compass, and 3 rounds of .30 caliber. "We hold the ridge," he said simply. "When they come, we make them bleed for every step." She didn't smile, didn't thank him. She just loaded her rifle and nodded. By dusk the next day, they had dug out a foxhole behind the bluff, set traps along the north trail, moved the livestock to the creek bend, hidden behind boulders. It wasn't enough. But it was something. 3 nights later, the riders returned, 5 now. Armed. Confident. But Evie was ready. The first fell in a trap, screaming as iron teeth closed around his calf. The second got as far as the shack before a bullet took him in the shoulder. Kale moved like smoke, silent and deadly, a knife flickering through the dark. It wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. When it was over, only one rider fled. Evie didn't chase him. She stood in the field beside Omen, rifle still warm, and watched the sky turn pale with morning. Dustwell woke that day to news of bloodshed and resilience. And for the first time, no one doubted the Carter girl. Kale stayed by her side for the rest of that week, wordless as ever. When he finally rose to leave, she walked with him to the edge of the bluff. "You'll vanish again," she said softly. "I'm not meant to stay," he replied. "But you are." Evie looked back at the land behind her, burnt, scarred, half-healed. "Then I'll keep it safe." Kale reached out, placed the talisman in her palm once more. "No more ghosts," he said. "Only roots." She nodded, and he turned, walking into the wind. Evie stood there a long time after, letting the silence fill her. Then she turned back toward the ranch, not broken, not whole, but hers. And waiting. For rain. For harvest. For the next fight. For whatever came. Because she was ready.